Hello. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Rocky Watch event titled Did the System Work? The Fragile State of American Political Institutions. I'm Jason Barabas. I'm a professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College and the director of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences. We organized this talk back in 2020, which seems like a long time ago, even though we were just a few weeks into January now. Since then, things have become more heated and hostile, including an attempted insurrection by a mob in DC, breaking into the Capitol, leading to a loss of life. It was an attack on the United States and its electoral institutions. Crimes were committed and perpetrators are being prosecuted. But the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris took place yesterday without significant problems. It required a huge military and security presence, however. But throughout all of this, the machinery of American democracy worked. Elections in the states were confirmed. The Congress, the courts, the Vice President, Michael Pence, performed an important duty and lived up to their functions as enumerated in the Constitution. Articles of impeachment were passed in the House after an effort to encourage the Vice President to invoke the 25th Amendment. We've also seen provisions of the 14th Amendment be used possibly to prosecute those who are involved in these acts. On these points and others, the rules and institutions of America functioned. The founders anticipated bitter fights just as this one. They designed structures to counteract these tendencies. There have been changes over the years, and certainly there are opportunities to think about changes in the future. Tonight, let's hear from two experts who have studied presidential and congressional branches of government and really have a lot to say about democracy in America across the years. Our first speaker is Matt Dickinson. He's a professor of political science at Middlebury College. In the past, he's taught at Harvard, where he also received his PhD working under the legendary presidency scholar Richard Neustadt. Dickinson is an internationally recognized expert on the presidency and the executive branch. He has written numerous articles, chapters, and a book titled Bitter Harvest, FDR, Presidential Power and the Growth of the Presidential Branch, published by Cambridge University Press. And he's currently at work at another manuscript titled Clerk or Leader, the President and the White House Staff, People, Positions, and Processes from 1945 to 2020. This is going to examine the growth of the presidential staff post-World War II era. Turning to our other panelists, it gives me great pleasure to welcome again back to the Rockefeller Center, Linda Fowler. She's a professor of government in the Frank J. Reagan Chair of Policy Studies Emerita at Dartmouth College. Dr. Fowler directed the Rockefeller Center from 1995 through 2004. Prior to coming to Dartmouth, Fowler was a professor of political science at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. She's an expert on American politics, particularly congressional elections. She's published numerous articles, chapters, and books. Some of those include Political Ambition, Who Decides to Run for Congress by Yale University Press, Candidates, Congress, and the American Democracy by Michigan University Press, and Watchdogs on the Hill, The Decline of Congressional Oversight of U.S. Foreign Relations by Princeton University Press. In the past, she was selected to be a Guggenheim Fellow and has received rewards for both her research and her teaching. Many of us continue to turn to her talks and lectures, such as the illuminating session she gave for alumni of Dartmouth College last fall in the Electoral College. Tonight, we are honored to have Professor Dickinson and Professor Fowler share their thoughts on the state of American institutions. Each is going to speak on a series of topics for a few minutes, alternating and then moving on to the next topic. I will return at the end and open it up for questions. We encourage you to ask your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. Our student assistant, Ben Bogle, will moderate the Q&A and close out the session. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and let's turn to our panelists. Thank you.
Are we on? Well, thanks so much for that lovely introduction. And it's always a pleasure to share a stage with Matt Dickinson. He and I do a lot of song and dance routines for VPR. And when I was thinking about doing a talk like this, I immediately thought of him because I admire his scholarship and his balanced perspective so much. So Matt, here we are having a conversation. Who knew when we planned this talk last December that we would have just had inauguration barely. And so now after 2 months of wrangling about the election, the invasion of the Capitol, all of the anxiety surrounding the inauguration, would you say the system worked?
I'm going to cue off Jason's observation that we were able to pull off an election. And that's no mean feat considering what happened on January 6th. And maybe that perhaps is too small a bar, too low a bar, but I think it's something we take for granted, this peaceful transfer of power. So in that sense, it worked. If we think about the past 4 years where we had a president who rhetorically was breaking every norm in the book, if you actually think about the impact that he had on the policy process, I would argue it was relatively minimal. So in that sense, yeah, the system worked. But when we focus on January 6th and that mob that overran the Capitol, we shouldn't overlook the underlying, I think, factors that led to that. They were just the tip of the iceberg here. Donald Trump was elected for a reason, because he captured the support from a significant group of people who believe our political institutions are broken. And if you look at the first slide, the argument I'm making here is Donald Trump is as much a symptom of the political instability in our system as he is a cause of it. And he came to power precisely because a number of people are dissatisfied with our institution. And if you go to the next slide, a significant indicator of that is, if you think about, we have two major parties, Republican and Democrat, and you think about control of our major institutions, the presidency, the Senate, and the House, and the 8 possible configurations. Since 2000, we have cycled through 7 of them. And had the vote gone the other way in one of those 2 Georgia Senate seats, we would have done all 8. That strikes me as a period of instability we haven't seen since the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And that suggests there's deep dissatisfaction with our institutions. Your thoughts?
Well, I remember a different kind of invasion of the Capitol when I worked there as a staffer. I came home from, went down to the Rayburn Garage in 1970, right before the big demonstration against Cambodia. And the garage was full of paratroopers with jeeps and walkie-talkies and battle gear. And I was horrified to think that the People's House would be invaded by soldiers. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that the Capitol Police had, and that their worries about having soldiers in the Capitol. I'm particularly sensitive, but I never in my mildest imagination thought I would see something that I saw on that Saturday, of people roaming the halls. I used to give tours of the Capitol, and I know that on the tours I gave, we never went down to the tunnels or checked exits and entrances. So I'm a little suspicious about what was going on the day before, and worried that this is, as you say, the tip of the iceberg, and something bigger. And if we'll go to my slides now, the first one that I wanted to share with the group is this: the public trust in government, which continues to remain below historic lows. Look where we've been since the Obama administration, and look where we are now. That it's been hovering around 20% of the population thinks that the federal government does what's right just about always or most of the time. That's a pretty startling number. And for a president, Trump, who is going to drain the swamp and restore America's greatness, it suggests that he was no more successful than his predecessor. The next slide, I think, is even more troubling. This comes from a broader study of democracy generally around the world, but this graph was pulled out for the United States. And what we see is the percent who are dissatisfied with democracy as a form of government. And in 2020, it's over 50%. So I think you can see why, looking at these 2 graphs, and we're done with that now, I think, you can see why politicians like Trump and like many members of Congress thought that they could get away with challenging the election and challenging the certification and the court cases and all the rest that went with it. The seeds for this were planted, and it just took a particularly unscrupulous person to come along and exploit them fully. Having said that, though, there are guardrails. The framers certainly were not naive. And in fact, one of the impulses for setting up the Constitution was Shays' Rebellion and other kinds of violence. So they certainly didn't expect government to be free of conflict, and they were very concerned that a government be obliged to control the government, but also to control itself. And I think this is where we need to ask ourselves a more fundamental question. Is there something about the Constitution that it's not well suited for the times we live in? We've been through other periods of crises. There were a lot of publications, if you recall, in the 1960s and early 70s, we need to amend the Constitution because it's not working. Periodically, people go through that ritual. And I guess the question is there something about the constitutional system that we ought to think about, or at least try to understand the ways in which it's contributing to the kind of dissatisfaction and potential for violence that we have now? So
well, I think that's a great question. I think it leads us into an important point that I think is often lost, and that is the framers created this system of government coming out of a revolution and concerned with an overriding objective, which was protect minority rights. It was not a system of government they designed to efficiently address society's problems. That wasn't their goal. So we often think about our system of government as one of separated powers, but as my mentor, Richard Newstead, Jason mentioned him at the outset, famously said, in fact, we have a government of separated institutions sharing power. Why do they share power? Precisely to avoid a government that can take away our rights and make it difficult to change the status quo unless there's overwhelming support for that. The problem is the expectations of 3 million people lined up on the eastern seaboard are not the expectations of the country that we have today. We expect much more from our government, and yet those expectations are still based on the same separated system that the framers designed here. And the other thing that has happened, Linda, and I think this is crucially important, the framers also expected limited government to be based on limited participation. They just eliminated whole sectors of the population from participating. And we have, and understandably and justifiably so, included those people. There's this process of democratization. That's good. But what it has meant is you've opened up our political system. Not everybody is participating equally. The loudest voices, the most partisan people are the ones that are dominating our elite, our institutions. They're people who are most active contributing money. They are the people who are most likely to vote. And as a result, it raises a question, which I will toss back to you. Is hyper-partisan democracy compatible with a Republican form of government? And I don't think I know the answer.
I think that is a problem. And it's partly, I think, because the People's Branch, which was intended by the framers to be the most powerful branch, it's the one that sits up on Capitol Hill. It's the high point that everybody sees. It's the place where all the major avenues converge. Because the framers intended it to be the most powerful branch, and they say that in the Federalist Papers, they divided it to two co-equal chambers, the House and Senate. And that means that too often the House and Senate, because they represent different constituencies, are not able to agree on legislation. There's a premium put on delay, obfuscation, minority viewpoints, and so forth. And so the branch that's closest to the people, the most intentional in terms of being able to discern the will of the people, not some remote president in the Capitol, their hands are tied, and they were tied deliberately. And I think in the end, one of the biggest problems we have is that in this modern system, the Senate tends to overrepresent urban states, and the House tends to overrepresent coastal states and big cities. And so the divisions, natural kind of geographic divisions, have really been cemented into this hyperpartisanship that we have right now. And so I think what people find is they have expectations. The Congress can't meet them. The classic would be immigration reform. George Bush wanted to make immigration reform his signature for his second term. And he had a Republican Congress with which to do it. And they couldn't agree within the party and they couldn't agree with the Democrats. So it died. Barack Obama also tried to get immigration reform, and there was a bipartisan gang of 13 or something like that, led by Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, also failed to get anything passed. And so enormous pressure built on the president, Barack Obama, to issue an executive order that would fix the problem. And I think that we've just had way too many incidents of that, so that people now expect that it's the president who's supposed to fix things. And that clearly leads to temptation for presidents to overstep the bounds of the Constitution. The presidential genie's out of the bottle. That happened during the New Deal. But I think if I had to point the finger at where the real problem is, I would point it right to my institution, the Congress. So what do you think about that?
Well, I'm glad to point the finger at your institution, but unfortunately, my institution, and we're both institutional partisans, share some of the blame as well. And you and I can walk our audience through this. Do you want to start with Congress, or should we go with the presidency?
Well, let me start with the Congress, since
Okay.
I'm the first to point blame, and then you can tell me where I'm wrong and blame your own institution if that's what you
Okay,
think.
fair enough.
The thing that I look at first of all is the framers didn't believe that the paper barriers of the Constitution would deter truly determined factions or tyrants. And they devised what they thought was a kind of a self-reinforcing Enlightenment style machine of checks and counterbalances that would sort of regulate itself automatically. And the key to that you find in Federalist 51, where Madison famously says, ambition will counteract ambition. And that what you need to do is to tie the individual ambitions of the members of their branch to make them assiduous in protecting their own branch. So the idea would be that members of Congress were first members of Congress, and they would resist encroachments by the president, and likewise the president would resist encroachments on his power by the Congress. That worked pretty well for quite a long time because the presidency wasn't that powerful, and because partisanship was not that strong for much of the 20th century in Congress. And where it particularly breaks down, I think, is where you have Congress itself divided, where one party controls the House and the other party controls the Senate. And then Congress can't speak with one voice when confronted with a belligerent president. So one of the fundamental problems, I think, is that Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and all those good folks, they assume that people's loyalties to their own institution would supersede any other loyalties, except perhaps to their state. And hyperpartisanship has just interrupted that kind of balancing act in very serious ways. It starts, I think it really starts with Newt Gingrich in the most serious way in 1994, when he comes to power as speaker starting in 95. And he basically, his view is, you have to destroy the institution. It's so corrupt. It's so incompetent. He wanted to replace it with sort of a parliamentary style legislature where the speaker would be the dominant voice rather than the committee chairs in the Congress. But he did succeed in destroying it in many ways, but he didn't put anything in its place. And maybe he had the intent of doing that, but he got into trouble with his own party and lost the speakership fairly quickly. So we've been left with an institution where it imperfectly empowered party leaders, but didn't give them all the tools they needed, particularly control of the nomination of their members. And that leads me to my second point, that the parties don't control the nomination of their members, interest groups do. And the idea that the interest groups and the parties have the same concerns about governance are just, they just don't coincide. Parties have to run on a record. Interest groups have to claim success on a narrow agenda for whatever their members reward them. And that, of course, has been reinforced with the growth of dark money and 501c3 PACs and Citizens United and so forth. And so you have a situation where the Republican Party, which is now in the minority in the House, is saddled with members who subscribe to the QAnon conspiracy. There's no way that any sane party leader would welcome that kind of a member in the caucus, but they're really not able to prevent it from happening. So on the one hand, there's a lot of party loyalty. There are tools in the hands of party leaders to try to craft a majority, not very many tools to punish, and a huge counterweight of organized interest groups. The third thing, and this is something that I've written quite a lot about now lately, is the decline internally of the committee system, which is the organization that people who study parliaments around the world always pointed to when they tried to explain why is it that the Congress of the United States is still a powerful legislature when every other legislature in a democracy is so subordinate to the prime minister and the party. And the answer was the committee system. And what committees provided were expertise, they provided additional leadership, they provided continuity, and they provided lawmakers would get together in their committees. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses. They had opportunities to negotiate behind closed doors. They were able to craft compromises across party lines. And that was one of the first things that Gingrich disrupted, by the way, which was to prevent cross-partisans from collaborating within the legislature. The other thing is that there were very powerful chairs who were strong enough and controlled the appropriations process and the legislation to punish presidents who got too big for their britches. And those committee chairs have been cut down to size, again, particularly with Republicans who imposed term limits on them. It's just impossible now to imagine somebody like a Sam Ervin engaging the attention of the committee and the news media and the White House for as many weeks as he did in that August of 1974, when I should have been writing my dissertation and was watching the hearings. At any rate, and so, and in particular, the loss of statutory capacity. Congress passes many, many fewer bills. It passes many more bills that turn out to have very serious errors after the fact. The bills are longer and so complicated that you can put bad stuff in them and nobody notices. In addition, the other congressional function of balance of budgetary process has become completely dysfunctional. We don't operate the government anymore except under continuing resolution. And finally, the lack of oversight. When Congress delegates many of its powers to the president, which it's done particularly since the Cold War, it needs to be able to ride herd on what the executive branch is doing, to call it to account, partly to determine whether new legislation is needed, and partly also to keep bureaucrats from going their own way or spending money in the ways they want. All of those things I've been able to document pretty heavily have suffered decline. This was not something that Trump did to the Congress. Congress did it to itself. And therefore, I think your question of can the Congress survive this hyper-partisanship has really got to go even one level deeper and say, does Congress as an institution even have the capacity to govern itself, let alone the country? So that's my 2 cents. Let's hear what you have to say about the presidency.
Well, if we go to the next slide, obviously my mentor, somebody named Richard Neustadt, and I was shamelessly plugging a book about his role in studying the presidency. Makes a great stocking stuffer. He famously proclaimed, in addition to describing our system as a system of separated institutions sharing power, he went on then to say, listen, because of that dysfunction of Congress, we increasingly look to the president to sort of step in and fill that void, and presidents have tried to do that. When we think of the presidency in its current context, it really dates back to Roosevelt. Franklin is sort of the origin of the modern presidency. And Roosevelt, to many degrees, is the epitome of what a good president should be. And that is a president who understands that to get anything done, you need to persuade members of Congress and other actors, political actors, that what you want to do is what they should want to do for their own self-interest. And the way you do that, more or less, is through bargaining. That was the crowning point that Neustadt taught a couple of generations of students. But the question is whether that model still works today. And let me look at three things, Linda, that I think are very important when we talk about the modern presidency. The effort to sort of step into this vacuum that you have so concisely described here, that Congress has created by its own dysfunction. Think about presidents legislatively. Think about them in terms of their rhetorical ability to persuade, and not just Congress, but the public. And then think about what we have seen recently, which is, if I can't legislate, I'll act unilaterally. Let's take each of them individually. What about legislation? Well, one of the things that Roosevelt did was he took it upon himself at the depths of the Great Depression to set a legislative agenda. We call that the New Deal, the 100 days. And we sort of take that for granted. Every president lays out a legislative agenda, but that was not the case prior to Roosevelt. And indeed, it was not institutionalized really until Truman and Eisenhower. That agenda setting power is a very powerful tool. It essentially tells Congress, this is what you should be debating. And Congress typically takes up that agenda. But the fact that they take it up is no guarantee that they're going to act on it, for all the reasons that you have pointed out. And if we go to the next slide here, this is just a shorthand description of everything you just went through. Essentially, you have two lines here. The red line is the House, the blue line is the Senate, and we're covering a swath of chronological history from the 1880s up through today. And what those dips are in sort of the tail ends where you're high is measuring the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in each chamber, the House and the Senate. I won't go into the weeds of how this is calculated, but essentially, this line is representing the difference between the party medians. That is, think of the center of gravity of the Democratic Party and the center of the gravity of the Republican Party ideologically. And what you see is when Neustadt was writing in those 50s and 60s, the differences between those parties wasn't that great. That's that trough. But since then, it's gone skyrocketed again. In short, we have an incredibly polarized Congress. What does that mean? It means if I'm Joe Biden, just like if I was Barack Obama or Donald Trump or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, if I want to get anything through Congress, I'm not going to get any help from the other party. I have to legislate through my own party, and that assumes I can legislate through my own party. Often, divided government means I can't, and so I'm stuck legislatively. So what do? I try something else. A second development here in the modern presidency, if you go to the next slide, is the development of the rhetorical presidency. And again, Roosevelt, the famous fireside chats, which in fact there was only about 14 of them, but we tend to sort of magnify his rhetorical prowess. Well, every president has sort of built on that foundation that Franklin Roosevelt laid down. And Donald Trump sort of took it to the nth degree with his midnight tweeting, 3 a.m. tweeting, daily tweeting. This is a development that has allowed presidents, because of technological developments, to sort of target their audience. But they've lost something. By targeting specific messages to specific audiences, they've lost the capacity to speak to the general public. And what this has meant is that you see what I'm showing here on this chart is public approval, dating from Truman on the left all the way to Trump on the right. And you can see for much of the period under study here, presidents were at times quite popular. That's the high green line here, and this is all from Gallup poll, above that 50%. And yeah, they would have their downturns, but there was a lot of variability. But as you get into the Obama administration, and particularly the Trump administration, look how stable that is. And Trump not only was stable, but low. In other words, your ability to move public opinion through these rhetorical appeals has become increasingly limited, partly because the public has become so ideologically sorted, with all liberals becoming Democrats, all conservatives becoming Republicans. As you well know, Linda, that was not always the case. It's a relative recent development. So, your ability to go public is actually limited in terms of changing public opinion. And of course, members of Congress, as you know well, Linda, can go public themselves. So what does that leave presidents? Well, it leaves them, if we go to the next slide, with what Joe Biden has tried to do. And by the way, sorry, we haven't got to the next slide yet. Notice the difference between support among your own party as president and the opposition party. So what we have here again is looking at public opinion approval, from Eisenhower through Trump. And at the top is the support that you're getting from your own party. And at the bottom, the support from the other party. And you can see that gap widening as we go from left to right, from Eisenhower through Trump, so that by the time Trump is president, he has strong support from his own partisans, as Obama did, as George W. Bush did, as previous presidents, but he has no support from the other party, 6% on average. This is unprecedented, and it just means my messages are instantly polarizing the audiences. My party loves my messages. The other party can't stand them because it's my message. Now the next slide. And so what does that mean? It means increasingly presidents are relying on administrative tools to achieve their goals, unilateral action. And there is a superficial attractiveness here. With a stroke of the pen, I can make a law, right? And Biden has already showed that his first day. He has issued a number of edicts. We're rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, overturning this travel ban from a majority, Muslim majority countries, mandating mask wearing on federal property. And this seems like a powerful tool, but note, many of those executive orders are overturning things that Donald Trump did. So they're not very durable. It's not the equivalent of building a coalition and passing a law that once passed stays on the books for years. When you operate without the necessity to build a coalition, which acting administratively really is, it's not clear to me that that is a powerful tool by which you can effect durable, lasting policy change. It is sort of a sign of presidential weakness, which is something that Neustadt pointed out long ago. When you rely on command authority, you're usually doing so because you're weak. And so the basic point here is, where does this leave presidents? Where does this leave Joe Biden? I think weaker than we might hope. Certainly not in a position to compensate for that power vacuum that Congress has created. And what we end up with is a cult of personality. And that's not how you govern. We have people, Donald Trump epitomizes somebody who ran an incredibly skillful campaign, but did not translate that into governing. And this cult of leadership comes at the expense of the institutional expertise needed to govern. He devalued that. He destabilized that. And it's not clear to me that Joe Biden is going to be able, in the next 2 years, before we see another election, is going to be able to reinvigorate our governing institutions. And that's my worry going ahead, Linda.
Well, lest we leave our audience completely depressed about these institutional breakdowns, I did see some bright spots at the end of this last congressional session, in the sense that there were bipartisan coalitions to pass COVID relief. There was bipartisan coalition to pass the defense bill and to withstand threats from the president that they renegotiate communications law in a defense budget bill. And so in the past, we've seen reform movements grow out of excessive executive pride. So after, in the 1940s, there was a big reform package that passed through Congress to increase its capacities. There was a big one after Nixon with Watergate, where there were a bunch of reforms to make Congress more effective. There probably should have been one at the end of the Cold War, or at the very least, when tensions between Congress and Reagan first started to get out of hand, I think. And there certainly should be one now. The presidency expanded so greatly after 9/11 that it's long past time for Congress to take a look at itself and think about reform. So HR 1 is a reform bill, but it's a reform of everybody else. It's about how Congress, about how states run their elections. What I would like to see is another reform package directed inside Congress. And there are some members thinking about that. It's pointless to have the subpoena power if the president defies it and you have no way of enforcing it. It's pointless to pass statutes if laying out presidential rules if the president is simply going to declare an emergency and move money from the defense budget to the construction of his wall. And I think that, coupled with the very real physical fear that members experienced, may provide the kind of kick in the pants that the institution needs to look at itself and think about how it's going to function going forward, because it continues to be very vulnerable in all the ways that then maybe they'll get lucky because Joe Biden is a decent man and is not going to push the envelope as a former senator, that they may feel, okay, it was just a bad apple. We don't actually have to do this, but that would be a mistake in my view. Do you have anything you want to add in terms of?
Well, very quickly, I have the same hope that Joe Biden, because of his experience, his familiarity to members of the Senate, and his appreciation for what Congress can do as a co-equal branch, will reinvigorate those ties. But even within Congress, and you know this better than I, Linda, both parties are struggling with extremists who are often more concerned with catering to those interest groups, those strong partisan voices that fund their campaigns and react to them on social media, than they are building bridges to the other side and reinvigorating institutions. I'm not trying to be negative here, Linda. I'm a glass half full guy usually as well, but there's no guarantees going forward that this system is going to work. The fact that it's lasted this long, amen, but there's no guarantees going forward. Let's hope.
Well, let's turn this over to Jason, who's ready with some questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda and Matt. That was wonderful. I'm trying to figure out how we can offer a course credit for people in the audience, because I think they learned an awful lot. I've been taking notes, things I want to follow up on. I just Googled HR 1 just to learn more about it. And that was actually going to be part of the first question I just want to kick things off with, given that the talk is focused on institutions and the state of institutions, and to think, we've talked so much about the features of Congress, features of the presidency. I was wondering if there's something that we can do about the system. Is there something contributing to how we are at the state where we are today? And what changes, if any, would you make to the institutions? I realize that perhaps there have been some introductions of proposals related to finance and maybe with the electoral reforms, but I encourage you to think broadly about, your wish list. And that may or may not be politically viable or realistic, but what would you recommend as in terms of changes, given how both of you understand in these institutions and how they've operated over the years?
Well, let me start. The answer is not more democracy. We owe a lot of bad stuff to the progressives, and maybe the worst one being primaries. But I think what I like to see is a return to capacity, to reward members who do their homework as legislators and who spend the time explaining issues to their constituents, and who develop very sore butt muscles from sitting in hearing rooms, looking at the arcana of budgets and so forth. Right now, people are just running for the Senate, certainly to run for the presidency. I would say at least half the members of the Senate right now are much more interested in becoming president than they are in becoming legislators. And Barack showed them, unfortunately, that that could be done, that you could run as an experienced politician with two years of the Senate on your belt. And so there are very few people who've come into the office, particularly in the Senate, with gravitas, people like Mitt Romney, who've seen a lot in their day and done a lot in their day and are entitled to respect for their opinions. And, you know, to pick Josh Hawley as the latest exhibit, and there are many I could pick, intelligent person, well credentialed, but basically not interested in developing a sense of how to govern. It's all about show and performance. And unfortunately, Donald Trump has demonstrated that that actually can work.
I have a similar concern and a similar recommendation on the executive branch side. I think too often presidents surround themselves in the White House with campaign staffs, loyalists, who understandably get rewarded for sticking with them through the cold winter days in New Hampshire and Iowa, but who do not know how to govern. And as the White House staff has acquired influence, it has tended to push to the periphery the institutional memory composed of those careerists who have served from administration to administration. I'd like to see the White House staff shrunk in size, and I've written a book about this, and in its stead have the executive branch agencies staffed primarily by careerists. Think about the Office of Management and Budget, for instance. Have them play a more influential role dealing directly with the president. Get rid of those layers of politicians that are insulating the president from direct interaction with the real government. That would be my first reform. But of course, that requires a president to recognize the limits of relying on campaign specialists.
Well, and of course, those campaign specialists are also in multiple layers now in the bureaucracy. We used to think about bureaucracies as being pyramids with a narrow point at the top and a broad base at the bottom. They now look much more like pentagons with a narrow base at the bottom of people who actually do work, a fat middle base of people who manage contracts with private sector industries and consulting firms, and then a very fat top of all the deputy assistant whatevers who are political appointees and the layers of political appointees. And this starts with Nixon, but really is perfected with Reagan, in part because of conservatives' mistrust historically that the bureaucracy they're all secret liberals and more loyal to democratic ideas than to their own ideas. And that has just gotten so far out of hand where you now have somebody who was a flunky in a press thing editing scientific reports from the CDC. I mean, and it's just absurd. You certainly can't attract good people to the bureaucracy when you subject them to that kind of pettiness and manipulation. And but Congress has allowed that. Congress is, after all, the one that creates the agencies and appropriates money for their positions. And they could put a stop to that like that if they really wanted to. Do you have another question for us, Jason?
I think we're going to turn it over to Ben to see if he's got a sense of what the audience members are asking and have him run the rest of the Q&A period. Thank you so much.
Good to see you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Dickinson and Professor Fowler. This has been absolutely fascinating so far. On the topic of reform, in particular reform to Congress, Reg Jones asks what your thoughts are on changing or removing the filibuster.
Okay, I'm going to be wishy-washy on this. I basically think we should have filibusters on judicial appointments and majority rule on legislative statutes. We actually have the reverse of that right now. So filibustering for judicial appointments, I think, is appropriate. That these are lifetime appointments. Major judges serve under multiple presidents. They ought to be broadly acceptable to a good swath of the Senate. Statutory ones, in the old days, the filibuster used to be used with such restraint. I mean, my ideal solution would be to have senators stop misusing it. But in the absence of that, since Democrats when they're in the minority, like to misuse it, as Republicans do when they're in the minority, I think there's probably, one could have some kind of a gradation that bills brought to the floor under certain kinds of provisions, would be filibuster proof the way we now have for budget resolutions. And it might vary, and I don't know what that would be, but I think it doesn't have to be an either all thing, and it actually isn't right now. But ideally, if a member stopped abusing it and saved it for just really serious things, that would satisfy me. But in the absence of that, I'm ready to try it. Although this is one of those reforms, be careful what you ask for, because it may seem like a good idea to Democrats now, as it did when Harry Reid removed filibuster restrictions from lower court nominees to deal with obstructionism in the Senate. And then, of course, it was he broke the dam, and then it was pretty easy for McConnell to do that on Supreme Court judges. So it's well worth discussing.
Yeah, very quickly, I think anything that forces you to have to deal with the other party is probably a good thing. So on balance, I'm in favor of maintaining the filibuster, realizing, of course, that it has been abused, as Linda quite correctly points out. And I would just add, the abuse of the filibuster really reflects these trends in Congress. It's become more partisan, more polarized. And, rules are epiphenomenal. They are a reflection of the underlying distribution of preferences of members. You're not going to change rules unless you change membership. And Linda's right, be careful what you wish for. You might get this, and we've seen as the sort of the cloture vote has been restricted on various issues, it's just become more partisan, not less so. And maybe counterproductive. If it allows you to pass legislation on the basis of one party, it may not be legislation that appeals not only to the other party, but to the broad centrist majority public. And that maybe reflect why we have this period of unstable majorities.
Certainly. Thank you. Gigi has a very thought-provoking question. Which other countries have a governmental structure that you prefer to ours, and why?
I can jump in very quickly and say, I teach American politics for a reason, which is my ignorance of other political institutions. And I always get away with it by saying American exceptionalism, which isn't necessarily a moral virtue. It just means our system's completely different than all these other systems. And I'm on safe ground saying that, particularly when it comes to the presidency. So I like our system, and I'm going to toss it over to Linda.
Well, and I will paraphrase Winston Churchill. It's the best system for us, except for compared to all the rest. And I think there is, what you have to recognize is that the framers, when they were putting the Constitution together, a number of the provisions that they justified on sort of principles of governance really were just expedient political bargains. The Senate being a noteworthy one. I guess I would be satisfied with reforming my own system if I could reduce the power of the Senate, or in some way make it more responsive to the public. It's always been an imbalance, but it's gotten acutely so now. What is it? The average Wyoming citizen counts 64 times more than the average citizen of California. And I just don't think that we can sustain our system with a Senate that is so out of whack, unless we reduce the powers of the Senate, make it more like, not as weak as the House of Lords, but maybe make it more like the upper chamber in the German system.
That's very interesting. Catherine has a question here. Yesterday, poet Amanda Gorman suggested powerfully that democracy is aspirational. Perhaps to ask if the system worked is premature, therefore. So has the American system achieved, or perhaps actually repudiated, true democracy?
Well, we were not designed to be a true democracy. But let's go back to the original part of our discussion. We were designed to be a system that gave unusual rights and leverage to various minorities. In fact, a famous political scientist in the 1950s coined the term that we have a government not of majority rule, but of minorities rule. And so that's really been the problem, is the people that count as part of the majority expands, as it has steadily throughout the 20th century. When that system expands and it's piled on top of a system that was predicated on minorities rule, that's very problematic. And but I think you don't have to define democracy as simply everybody's vote counts the same. What you can do is to try to create situations where people come together to deliberate and create their own sense of what their interests are. There's been a powerful movement along those lines many times in our political history. And I think we're seeing one of those right now. Perhaps the most optimistic thing I took from this election was that record-breaking vote total. And it may very well be that as more people learn how to express themselves and how to participate in their communities, they may become a little more realistic about what government reasonably can be asked to do. And they might also become a little more realistic about what the people who are different from them are saying.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, the history of democratization in America has been moving in a direction that I think all of us are pleased by: greater participation, a reduction of barriers. But what impact has that had? It hasn't always translated into equal voices. That is to take everybody taking advantage equally of these lowering of the barriers. And so we're always falling short of this ideal, in part because we subscribe to equality of opportunity, but that does not result in equality of results. Economically, for instance, when you think about these reform movements, our reforms have always been more successful in increasing political participation, but they haven't really translated into addressing, for instance, economic inequities. And invariably, economic inequities translate into political inequities as well. That's an ongoing struggle, and we've fallen short of that. And at the same time, we are making progress, but it is aspirational.
Absolutely. Thank you. Darla asks, how can this country get back on track when a good portion of the population are operating on an alternative set of facts? How can you have a conversation with fellow citizens when their views aren't grounded in reality? And there might be institutional solutions to this or something else.
Let me go to an experience I had with my 94-year-old mother, who was in the memory care unit. And she would tell me about the nice visit she'd had with her parents. And what I learned quickly to do was to not say, that's dumb, or that didn't happen, or there's no way that could happen. I would sort of interact with her in a way that, well, tell me more about that, and how are they, what did they say? And she almost always, as in bad shape as she was, would sort of look at me and then say, that didn't happen, did it? And I would say probably the best thing we can aim for is to be realistic about the things we think we can do as a society, and be clear about when they're working and when they're not working. And that means, I think, for the majority party to be more willing to embrace criticism. I think the criticisms of the Democratic Party elites were well justified, that they were doing just fine, thank you, and everybody else, that was something that they were not hearing from the heartland. I also think that a lot of people hadn't really listened. They certainly could have heard it had they been listening to people in the Black Lives Matter movement. And once those killings were on Facebook and whatever, a lot of people changed their minds. So, but we can't change minds by just exhorting people or telling them that they're deplorable. I think we need to start with helping people to figure it out for themselves, just as in the classroom. a professor in a classroom would never say that's a dumb, or shouldn't say that's a dumb question, or where'd you get that dumb idea? You always try to bring people along. Well, where is that coming from? And then oftentimes if you do that, and this is where the news media is absolutely counterproductive to the kind of thing that I'm talking about, and where people putting together their own conversation groups, I think in part to feel like somebody hears them, are just ending up in their own little echo chambers. So that's had a perverse effect. I think maybe with all the podcasts that are happening and non-major media opportunities happening, there may be some, maybe somebody needs to start a blog that brings folks of differing persuasions together. And I bet it might be pretty popular.
Very quickly, 2 points. I spent my leave in 2015-16 attending campaign rallies, including several Trump rallies, and had conversations, and Linda's spot on. The most important thing I learned is they want to be heard. They believe that nobody's listening to their concerns. They're being ignored by the political elites in both parties. They didn't necessarily agree with everything Donald Trump said, but he seemed to listen to them. The second thing is the media. The media's been under, and I'm a former journalist, so I'm sympathetic. They've been under tremendous economic pressure. And the way they responded is by narrowcasting, by finding their niche audience and playing up to that. And that's fine, because we have this private media that has to raise revenue through advertising. But there's been a cost. And the cost is, I think, that a significant number of people do not believe what they think a partisan media is telling them. So, I don't know how we're going to get out of that, but I think Linda's advice is as good as any, which is we need people out there who don't attack the opponents as, racist, bigoted people, but make an effort to listen to what they're saying.
Thank you. We're edging towards the end of tonight's event, so I'm going to conclude with a question from Ellen, who asks, how worried are the presenters about attempts to suppress the vote and delegitimize the results of elections?
Whoa, very worried. And it's not over. I think one of the things that the wonderful turnout from 2020 demonstrated is that American voters are not apathetic, that when people go and ask them to vote, which is what the Republican mobilization, a very successful Republican mobilization did in 2020. And Democrats also got a lot more people to the polls. I think the idea that, people have said, oh, people don't care, if they cared, they would vote. Turns out they will vote. And so the question is, I think, going to be what's going to happen in state legislatures where the majority party knows it's not a majority party unless it suppresses the vote. And we've seen a lot of that with this talk of voter fraud, and we're going to see a lot more of it. And unfortunately, the courts, I think, are not going to be the bulwark against that kind of manipulation that they have been in the past. So I'm worried.
I'm worried one of the unintended benefits of the coronavirus might be the movement towards vote by mail that may be institutionalized in a way that is going to permanently boost turnout in some states. Again, vote by mail has had some mixed records, but yeah, just to echo Linda's point, there's no guarantee that our institutions are going to maintain support. It's an ongoing effort, and that includes our election system. I was not keen, obviously, on what Trump said. I would just point out for equal time, the Democrats weren't a lot better in 2016 in attacking the notion that Donald Trump was a tool of the Russians.
Oh, was that not true? Actually, I think to not be smart alecky about it, but I think the part of it has to do with people do feel that their voices are being drowned out by interest groups and by big donors, and I think Trump hit a nerve when he said, I don't need their money because I have so much. nobody's going to be able to buy me. And I think a lot of people thought, gee, that kind of makes sense. Maybe maybe he will be able to clear the swamp. But in fact, the opposite happened. So we're back, I think, to square one and trying to figure out ways to bring people into the process.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Dickinson and Professor Fowler. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're having a pretty busy week at Rocky, and next Monday at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting an event entitled How We Study Race with Professors Kimberly Brown in the English and Creative Writing Department, Matthew Delmont of the History Department, Deborah King of the Sociology Department, and Engbeng Lim of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. It should be a fascinating discussion, and we hope you all can attend. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a good night.